Max Verstappen may have won the Italian Grand Prix at a record speed, but the big talking point was once again those battling McLaren drivers. John Noble, Lando Norris, led Piastri P2, P3. Piastri stopped first, one lap before. Norris had a slow stop, and then he got the instruction, or rather Piastri got the instruction to swap back round again, having gained the position. So how did all of this play out?
This is about the racing rules and the fairness that's been at the heart of everything McLaren's done. It's tried to keep things very equal between the drivers, and today was a scenario kind of similar to Hungary last year, but not quite identical. We were coming to the only stop of the race. McLaren had extended the stint as long as possible to try to head off the possibility of a safety car, because it was a late safety car. They would have had a cheap pit stop and would have beaten runaway race leader Max Verstappen, who'd already pitted and was behind. But it was getting to the phase where they would come under a little bit of pressure perhaps from Charles Leclerc, so they had to choose how to pit them. Lando was consulting on the radio. He said, you can if you want to let the second car pit first, that's all fine, as long as there's no undercut, and this was the key. So he felt his position was safe. So it should have been fairly straightforward. You pit Oscar on lap 45, you pit Lando on lap 46, and they resume, and it goes on. But Lando's pit stop went wrong. It took 5.9 seconds compared to Oscar's 1.9, and then this opened the door for them to say, we need to switch the positions.
Yeah, it's 3.9 seconds in terms of the difference in total pit lane time. So that's from the entry control line to the exit one. So it's clear that made the difference. Now, obviously, people were saying, was that a decision that needed to be made? Oscar Piastri said, well, I thought we said pit stop problems were fair game, so Piastri wanted to stay ahead. Now, it was interesting because Andrea Stella, after the race, he was talking about this, and he said that it was necessary for them to do this in compliance with their principles of fairness, and that's why they had to change it round. But do you think that holds water?
I think there is an element of fairness to it, but I think there are grey areas to this, and it primarily relates to, was a slow pit stop part of the areas where they had discussed and had agreements in place about swapping positions in this scenario? Because Oscar Piastri gave that hint over the team radio that this wasn't part of the plan, that this was something that wouldn't be counted. He was asked about his opinion to clarify it in the press conference afterwards, and again said, I said everything I wanted to say on the radio. So being very kind of smart in what he was saying. And Andrea Stella, you were at his press session, he was asked twice today to clarify, were slow pit stops part of the deal, that you would swap positions? And I think he ducked the question, didn't he?
He did, yeah, a couple of times. Well, I asked him basically where the line is, because what's different from Hungary, as we've talked about, is that slow pit stop. Because had it been normal, they wouldn't have swapped positions. So you could say, well, that's fair game. Now, Stella's position is, well, had we pitted them in a normal sequence, Norris wouldn't have lost time to the undercut, and he would have been able to absorb that pit stop time loss to the error, which incidentally looks like it was a gunning error, because you could see in the footage that the tyre changer had to hit on the shoulder, the gunner, to say, look, it's not done properly, so Norris could be released. So that's the big question. How far back do you go in terms of these principles and rules? And it goes back a long way, because you can even start bringing Saturday into it, can't you?
Yeah, I think the problem they've set now, and this is something that Toto Wolff commented on tonight, he says the precedent has now been set, and it's going to be a hard thing to back out of. So what Toto believes, and this is the situation that McLaren's now in, is that they are now at the whim of events happening and being in very difficult positions to decide what is a fair swap, what is an unfair swap, what is a mistake that requires a swap, what is a mistake where they have to hold positions, and what if we get to a title decider, we have the same scenario, identical scenario play out, and they ask the driver in the lead to give up the position and sacrifice the World Championship because of a slow pit stop. So I think it's a very complicated situation that's in, and I think the ultimate judge of this can't be today. We can't judge the fairness. Was this the right or wrong decision today? This is something that's going to play out. And I think F1 often has an ability to throw up circumstances, throw up events that cause trouble further down the road. So I think this is something that's going to kind of bubble away. And I think the real question ultimately needs to be asked is, was the hassle, is precedent actually worth it for 3 points?
Well, Very, very much so. That's the question. And of course, there could have been all sorts of things that threw spanners into the works. They try and keep Piastri and Norris working well together. There was that thing on Saturday I referenced, which was Piastri was asked if he could give Norris a tow at the end of Q2 because Norris was looking a little bit dicey to advance, which he did. So they try and play by these rules, but you can start bringing all sorts of things into it. You can say, well, they stayed out longer to be able to get onto the softs because that was the best chance of attacking Verstappen, and Verstappen in the Red Bull did have a pace advantage. They were clearly quicker, clearly going to win. But had they not stayed out longer, then Norris wouldn't have lost some of that advantage and cushion he had over Piastri. So it becomes very, very complicated and difficult, doesn't it? And there's so many factors, and you can start tripping over yourself to avoid other risks as well, that then puts you into this situation.
Yeah, one team boss likened it today to opening Pandora's box, that now there is a ridiculously complicated situation of what is fair, what isn't fair, what are mistakes that we counter, and these things can roll out in ways that nobody can predict. So I think it's a policy that McLaren have done. They believe they've acted in total fairness, because Andrea Stella was unmoved tonight. So this is the principle of fairness. These are the papaya rules. This is how we go racing. I think the issue is they're going to have to cover off so many areas now in terms of what this is, and what invariably happens is that you can't go into the fine details. So is a slow pit stop that's 1 second slower in decides position fair game to swap now, or does it have to be 2 seconds, or is it 1.5 seconds? So I think it's opened a lot of difficulties potentially down the road for the team.
Absolutely, best of intentions can send you down a tricky path, and obviously that desire to avoid pitting them in the normal sequence at the risk of hitting a safety car that could hand it to Piastri played its part in that. So everywhere you look, there's problems, and down the line, if we get to say Abu Dhabi and this happens, and let's say, just for the sake of argument, Piastri's now ahead and he's going to win the World Championship by a point, but is told to swap them around in the same circumstances, he's not going to do it really, is he? You just can't ask that. So this is the problem. Now, personally, I think McLaren's explanations, they do stand up. I am inclined to think that the time lost in a pit stop and it should count, if you like, and agree with Piastri, so I wouldn't have swapped them. However, I'm not privy to every single discussion and rule they've had. What do you think?
I think if the rules that they had agreed beforehand said that slow pit stops would not be enough to justify a swap, then they shouldn't have swapped. I think what the key to how McLaren have kept these pair of drivers working together, how they've ensured that Oscar was asked to give Lando the tow on Saturday and complied, was asked to give up position today and complied, is because everything's been laid out in advance. Where things go wrong is if you make agreements beforehand and then you don't stick to them, because then problems get kind of thrust into the system. So this is the critical thing. If slow pit stops were not part of the agreement, then they shouldn't have swapped today. And that's the kind of the clear answer we don't have yet. What were the terms of the agreements that were laid down that Oscar was racing to?
And the one thing Andrea Stella did say is we will review. And he said it's important to define review. We mean review in the pursuit of excellence. So it's less a review to see if we made a mistake, but a review to see if we applied it correctly. They'll have more conversations, etc. I think it's also interesting, because I said if this was the last race and it decided the championship, Piastri wouldn't have ceded. I'm sure it briefly crossed Piastri's mind not to do it. But when it's second place, when it's a 3-point swing in his position, it was pragmatic of him to take the hit, because it shows he's playing the team game. He might benefit next week, and it gives him a bit of leverage behind the scenes to say, hang on, not quite sure that was right. Maybe it would have been different if it was for a win though.
Yeah, Andrea Stella said something very interesting on Saturday. He was asked about Oscar giving the tow, that whether he anticipated Oscar would follow it, because Lando was in danger of getting knocked out of Q2. There was a risk, so every single bit to help him get through is important. Then he was asked, but would you anticipate this to happen in Abu Dhabi in a title finale, for example? And he said, how would you react if Oscar refused? He says, I would consider it not the most elegant move, but sometimes racing doesn't necessarily require elegance, as long as you operate within the principles. And I think that's the key now that needs to be laid down to both Oscar and Lando. It's those clear guidelines, clear parameters they're operating with, and if they're in writing, you've got to stick to them, even if it creates fallout, even if you get the world's media on their back saying, this was an unfair situation for Lando to lose a position through a slow pit stop, but you've got to stick to the principles within the team.
Exactly, and it's all about those boundaries. Will they tighten things up? Will they define it further? And just the way things work, like you've alluded to, F1 has a habit of throwing up problematic scenarios. So I think McLaren generally have handled all of this kind of thing very well. I think Stella's argument holds up. They've applied the principles, but are they trying to control too much? That, for me, is going to be one of the big questions of the final part of the season, because you can bet this sort of thing is going to happen again.